Hi there. This is John, your instructor, and it's time for us now to enter the next module, the module entitled Textual Criticism. Nowadays, when we discuss criticism or when you hear the word criticism, it usually has a negative connotation, a negative meaning, as in we criticize someone because they've done something wrong, or we consider somebody critical if they're constantly seeing the wrong way or seeing the bad side of something, kind of like a pessimist. That's not what criticism means in this case. Criticism here means to examine critically the text of the New Testament. Now, you will read a lot of information in chapters 10 and 11 of your textbook. Those chapters and that information will point out that people have different approaches in studying the text that we consider the New Testament. Yes, some people do consider those texts from what I would consider a critical perspective, as in a very skeptical perspective. We can learn even from those who examine the scriptures in that light, just as we can learn from those people who examine the scriptures in the context of the church tradition and in the context of the canonicity, the reliability of the scriptures as well. So as you read this material, the material is not meant to confuse you. It's meant to open your eyes and enlighten you about ways of looking at the scriptures. You'll read a lot of information in these chapters. For instance, people have noticed a lot of similarities between the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A lot of similarities. Does this mean that there was an outside document that all three writers appropriated as they wrote their own Gospels? Luke himself says that he conducted interviews and used all the material he could to write his Gospel. Some people will say that Mark wrote his Gospel first and then Matthew and Luke used it. Well, that's a possibility at least, and at this point is a commonly accepted theory. It's quite okay to consider these theories and to consider them from the right perspective, and quite possibly Mark did write his gospel first. One of the things that we do know is that all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were all written right around AD 62 or earlier. We know that St. Luke finished the book of Acts while St. Paul was sitting in Rome awaiting his trial before Nero, and this happened right around AD 62 or something like that. So we have three Gospels all written very close to the events that they discuss, that they explore and explain to us. That's something to keep in mind when you start talking about the reliability of the text. It's important to remember that all three of those Gospels were written literally within a generation of Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. So, with this information, what does it mean? Well, for one thing, we can consider the materials that we have, the Gospels that we have, incredibly reliable and accurate. Why do I say that? We have better evidence, better textual evidence of the events in the Gospels than we have that Julius Caesar conquered Gaul. And yet, no one questions whether Julius Caesar conquered Gaul. We have over 5,000 either complete manuscripts or parts of manuscripts of the New Testament, and all of those 5,000 manuscripts agree with one another to a greater than 95% accuracy, which means that less than 5% of the vast number of an amount of material we have disagrees. This means that you can trust these manuscripts. By the way, the manuscripts are unanimous on every verse that covers any major doctrine in the history of the church. Also, We know that all the documents that we have in the New Testament were all written before AD 100. We have church historians who lived literally within 2 generations of the apostles themselves, who can accurately verify that all of the writings already existed in their lifetimes and could be traced back to the apostles themselves. One thing I would point out about the textual criticism and so forth, as far as its usefulness, is that it often helps us to place materials in the correct context. People sometimes forget when you're in the Old Testament that the vast majority of the Old Testament is written in poetry. It helps to know the genre of the materials you're reading. It helps to know that the materials that you read in the New Testament are written in a historical fashion. They're written in a matter-of-fact fashion. It helps to know certain things about how the Greeks approached things, because that becomes very helpful in later understanding the writings of St. Paul far more accurately and far more thoroughly. One last thing that I would point out, and some people find this a little difficult to believe, but I think it bears mention. When we start considering the genres of the New Testament, of the writings of the New Testament, when we start considering the accuracy of the New Testament and so forth, we also need to consider the complexity of those writings. We have only 4 books that contain the sayings of Jesus in any depth. 4 books that contain the sayings of the one that the church calls the divine Son of God. Those are the only 4 books we have in all of human history. We then have the writings of the apostles, what we call the epistles, the letters in the New Testament, that far outnumber the Gospels, and the epistles tell us how to put those writings into practice. So it's important for us to understand that we have the Gospels that tell us what we need to know about the life of Jesus. Not necessarily what we want to know, but what we need to know. We then have the epistles that explain to us how the early church worked out the implementation of those teachings, and the implementation what did it mean that Jesus said this. We have to know how to apply it to our lives, and also what are the implications of Jesus' actions and also his teachings. So as you go through this module, as you read the material in the book, I want you to remember that you need to contact me if you have any questions. Chances are I have answered the question before in another semester, and I will gladly answer the question again for you. If it turns out that you ask a unique question, totally possible, then I will search until I find an answer for you. By the way, this is the point in the semester where I go ahead and tell you that if you live in Tuscaloosa, I'm always up to take students to lunch. If you don't live in Tuscaloosa, well, I'll have to find a suitable substitute. Meanwhile, I hope you're continuing to enjoy the course, and that you're continuing to learn a lot more about the New Testament. As always, contact me if you have any questions or comments.